We'll just maybe let a few more people filter in, but we can get going with some introductions. I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Timothy Watkins. I'm on staff here at ECHO, and my background is in agroforestry and fruit trees and nursery management. I'm involved with overseeing our agriculture operations here, and I'm really happy to be working with you all, facilitating this discussion today. So I will just take a moment to make quick introductions for each of our panelists, and then maybe they can elaborate later on if I leave something out. But I'd like to start with Kathleen Charles. Welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. Kathleen has extensive experience working in Latin America and Africa in the area of international development, banking, and finance. And she has a focus on entrepreneurs and providing resources, especially for women engaged in agriculture. And more recently, she is working with a group called Reservoir, and their goal is to develop, manufacture, and distribute climate-smart agriculture tools for smallholder farmers. So thank you again, Kathleen, for being here, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me, actually. Delighted.
All right, excellent. Next, I'd just like to introduce Floyd Dowell. Good to see you, Floyd. Floyd has a PhD in agriculture engineering, and he's retired scientist and collaborator from the USDA Agriculture Resource Service at the Center for Grain and Animal Health Research in Manhattan, Kansas. Floyd also is taught as an adjunct professor at Kansas State University and directs the nonprofit organization Planting Hope International. And so we're really pleased to have you with us today, Floyd. Thank you for being willing to join. Sure. And yeah, thanks for coming. Lastly, I'll introduce Noah Elhart. So Noah is joining us from Senegal, West Africa. And Noah is serving at Beersheba Project in Senegal, and where he trains discipling farmers and works to develop adaptable, profitable, regenerative agriculture systems in the Sahel. Some areas of interest of his are insect ecology, underutilized fruits, intensive grazing, dairy goats, and soil life. And he's also a very good photographer. So I'm also proud to say Noah is a former intern, so it's good to have you with us, Noah. And great to have you here with us today. Are you there? Can you hear us, Noah?
Yes, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Okay, excellent. Before we jump into the discussion, I just have two announcements that I need to go over. The first one is that we are going to be recording this session. And so if you have concerns about being included in on that recording, then you are free to exit if that's a concern for you, or you can also mute, keep your video off. We will probably leave all the participants muted at this point so that we can really focus on the panelists. At some point, we may open it up to direct questions from our participants. So you can participate in the discussion through the Q&A or the chat. We're looking at both of those, but there's the session Q&A, increasing production, and you can put questions in there for our panelists to answer and discuss, and then you can also vote on those questions as well. And we will try to address the questions that get the most votes. Okay, so maybe before we keep going here, if I'll go back to Kathleen. Perhaps Kathleen, would you just give maybe a really brief summary, 2 or 3 minutes, on what you are specifically doing in appropriate technology and how that might relate to increasing smallholder production. And then we'll jump to Floyd and then to Noah. So I'll give each of you a chance just to briefly explain some of the ways that you're interacting with appropriate technology in your context. But we'll start with you, Kathleen. Kathleen, are you there? Okay, we'll wait for Kathleen. Floyd, if you heard that question, if you can maybe just quickly describe in a few minutes some of the ways that you have engaged in appropriate technology
I'm
for
here now,
smallholder
sorry.
production. Okay, great. Kathleen, we'll jump back to you and then move to
Somehow
Floyd
I
and
did
then
get
Noah.
cut off. Okay, sorry.
Okay.
So you want me to go ahead?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Floyd Dow. I spent most of my career in developing technology to measure grain quality, and then more recently, last 10 or 15 years, on how do you preserve grain after harvest so that you don't lose it to insects or spoilage. So I've spent quite a bit of time looking at different appropriate technologies, hermetic storage, some locally available methods, additives that you can put on grain to help keep insects out, the emphasis on drying to prevent spoilage due to moisture content and the molds that are associated with that. And I had the pleasure of working with ECHO on several different projects to try to help farmers in various parts of the world to reduce losses after harvest.
Great, thank you, Floyd. Yeah, we enjoyed having you here last year for a seed storage and seed banking TAD, and remember some good information there, good approaches to seed storage. So we did talk about this session being increasing production, but I think it's also important to address what happens after production. You may grow something, but if you lose it, what good is that? So thank you, Floyd. Kathleen, we can jump back to you if you can just explain briefly ways that you're interacting with appropriate technology for smallholder production.
Well, yes, as I was saying, I spent many years in the field in Africa, both in East and West Africa, working closely with the farmers on being able to access finance in order to be in a position to acquire tools and equipment that are adapted to the soil, adapted to their needs, cultivation, and also climate smart agriculture. And what Reservoir is doing currently, as I'm associated with them as well, are actually developing a dynamo, what we call a no-till hoe, as well as a very specialized dryer that can dry fruits and vegetables in such a way that farmers can be able to use this resource as a secondary source of income. And these tools are really devoted to smallholder farmers that need to be able to access affordable, yet tools that really attempt to preserve the soil, the nutrients in the soil, and be able to have a conservationist approach to being able to increase productivity. It's not just a question of tractors and power tillers, but it's actually using at the smallholder farmer level these tools, which I think is really something that, especially in today's world, can be very useful.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Kathleen. So you are engaged on both sides of the equation, the production side and also that post-harvest, maybe value-adding side.
Exactly.
Noah, thank you. Noah, can you give us a brief summary of your different experiences working with appropriate technology through Beersheba's work in Senegal?
Yeah, sure. So here at Beershiba, we're primarily a training center for small-scale farmers from throughout West Africa. But we also run a commercial farm on site. And so we end up kind of using technologies from a large spectrum of the scale of appropriateness, or what's appropriate for some of our stakeholders might not be appropriate on our commercial farm, and vice versa. And so we end up getting to play with and try out a lot of different technologies on a wide part of that spectrum. And then most importantly, as our interns return to their field and return to their different scenarios or situations that they're in, as we do follow-ups, we can see kind of which technologies end up being used or not being used, which end up being appropriate to many farmers or only to a few farmers. But it's a constantly developing field. And we do, our farm we do both grain crops, vegetable production, as well as animal production. And so kind of in all of those three areas, we're playing with different appropriate technologies.
Okay, excellent. So you're providing kind of a trialing or vetting role for some of those technologies before maybe they find their way to the farmer.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm just looking now if we have any questions that have come in. Otherwise, I have a few just to get us started. Okay, so maybe this can be just a general question for any of the three of you to answer. But what do you see as being some of the biggest opportunities, the higher impact opportunities to improve smallholder production using appropriate technology? Where are the low-hanging fruit in smallholder, thinking 2 hectares or less field size or land size? What are some really great opportunities that are available to us there?
I'm sure we're all probably a little bit biased in given our backgrounds, but mine would be in the post-harvest. We lose about 80% of a crop Africa-wide after harvest. So to me, a low-hanging fruit for at least for cereal grains, your corn, wheat, soybeans, milo, so on, would be simple technology to preserve what you've harvested. And a simple technology is a hermetic storage in a bag or a barrel that can be very readily available. So that'd be my opinion of a low-hanging fruit to preserve what you already have.
Exactly. And also, if I may add to that, I completely agree with you on the post-harvest losses. It's not just having a refrigeration station, which most of these places in rural areas don't have. And speaking of Africa now, they don't have access to electricity, or it's scant, or it's interrupted by power outages. But it's also being able to integrate the use of the different technologies at a simplified yet sophisticated level that can be able to enable the farmer to increase the yields, also to preserve and conserve the environment and the soils, and then be able to reap the benefits of a very simplified transformation process. And in the case of larger scale or connection to commercial farmers, then be able to see we can produce a higher quality product. We can also preserve it, but we can produce a higher quality product by using these different types of appropriated technologies. I know I just want to mention the African Development Bank has a big project on technologies for agricultural transformation in Africa. And I've been working with them on the sidelines, also just in terms of introducing our information to them and seeing how we could work together and leverage resources. My point being here is that we need to integrate the process and look at the different commodity value chains, be able to then adapt those technologies to the appropriate value chains, the commodity value chains, and the needs of those farmers. So something I would really like to emphasize.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. It's good to have that bigger picture. It's an important part of scaling things up. I have one question, just sticking with you here, Kathleen. This is from Wesley Green. And it kind of relates to what you were just talking about with that importance of soil conservation, soil life. And I know, Noah, you've, at least Beersheba has been active in this as well. But Kathleen, have you ever worked with biochar in soil conservation was the question. So biochar as a soil amendment, and that's just a question maybe you could respond to quickly. Otherwise, we can also hear from Noah. I know that you've got some experience with some biochar products.
And I must say, not directly, but I'm certainly aware of biochar. So I think we'll pass that on to Noah to perhaps give us a much more in-depth view of that. That would be good.
Sure.
Yeah, so biochar is something that we have some experience with. We make charcoal here in Senegal, which from a conservation point of view seems always a little bit counterintuitive, because charcoal production is one of the primary causes of deforestation here in the Sahel. But we are managing our kind of regenerated woodland on a sustainable level, and we can produce enough charcoal just from pruning trees and from using other biomass for our needs. And so, as many of you know, biochar is a valuable soil additive in terms of increasing the capacity of the soil to hold nutrients. Has a lot of other benefits as well. And it's very stable, very long-term stable. So its benefits are not just this year, but kind of a long-term benefit. To us, it always seemed like something that was very expensive in terms of if you're going to do it on a larger field scale, not just on a small garden plot. It takes a lot of biochar to kind of have any noticeable effect. And that biochar, you could be using it in other ways. You could be cooking with it, or you could be doing other things with it. At least in our case, where we're using charcoal. But in fact, something that we found a few years ago and that we've integrated since then. I think there's been some echo publications since on that. I wrote up a little article last year on this subject if you'd like to learn more. But we now feed our biochar to our livestock. So biochar also has a very positive impact on livestock, on their gut health, on their feed conversion ratios, on their overall health and quality of the meat. There's all kinds of a slew of benefits to feeding biochar in the animal feed. And so you add 1%, 2% of the animal feed in biochar. And then that biochar passes on through the manure. It's already pre-charged with nutrients. And then wherever your livestock are, whether you use their manure for compost or whether you graze them in a pasture, that biochar will get integrated into the soil. In many cases, if you have dung beetles in your area, the dung beetles will then bury that biochar into the soil, even 30, 40 centimeters down into the ground. And so that's a very, I don't know if that counts as an appropriate technology or not at that level, but it's like multiple technologies almost wrapped into one, and has impacts kind of across a wide range of your farming system.
That's great. Thank you, Noah. Yeah, so if you are interested in that biochar document, that is something on Echo Community that you can find. We have another question here. This is from Sarah Sitzma. Question about using Pix Bags. So Floyd, perhaps this is something you can address. The Pix Bag for grain storage is pretty well known, but she's asking whether it can be used to store dried cassava or even dried sweet potatoes. Would that be a potential application of that Pix Bag?
The nice thing about having the chats pop up is I could Google that right quick and look up a study. I've worked with Pix Bags a fair amount with certain cereal grains, and they are very effective on certain pests in certain environments and certain crops. When I've not done sweet potatoes or those types of crops and picks, but when I looked up an article right quick, I can certainly understand their conclusion that it did not work for sweet potatoes and those types of crops against the larger grain borer. That larger grain borer is a mess. And if you're using any type of plastic bags, the Grain Pro bags, the Pix bags, that larger grain borer just chews right through them. And so it appears from just a couple of articles that popped up that it's not effective for those types of commodities. But you could use something like a metal drum, a metal barrel, where you can, that's a larger grain bore. I don't think it's going to chew through like a 100-liter barrel or metal barrel, but something like that you can cap off and make airtight should be very, very effective. But those plastic-based hermetics are not effective against that larger grain bore.
Thank you, Floyd. Yeah, that's good to have that perspective. Those bags are only so tough. I have a question here. This is from Julio Camacho. Thanks for the question, Julio. It's a question for Kathleen. He writes, you mentioned in your previous experience working to obtain funding to help structure and scale AT. Can you give us any ideas you have in order to help finance smallholders? So he agrees on working together with value chains, but any other ideas, especially in that area of finance for smallholders?
That's one of my areas of expertise, actually. As an example, in Tanzania, we were working with the rice paddy farmers in Ifakara region, which is north of Kilimanjaro. And the idea behind this was to convince one commercial bank to work with local partners, the SACCOs, for example, savings and cooperative societies, and also to work with the NGOs that were training and sensitizing the farmers on how to use the warehouse receipt schemes. Again, a mechanism, a financial instrument to help thwart the problems of post-harvest loss. I made a presentation in Geneva on this, and I'd be happy to send it to you. But mainly the idea behind this was creating a partnership where the banks were reticent without having some form of guarantee or some form of partnership with other groups and the producers themselves. Now, for the financing, to answer your question in a more straightforward fashion, the producer groups then had to become more formalized. And so they formed an apex organization. So they formed an apex organization in order to be able then to access the finance through the banks. And we helped them structure such an organization under a cooperative arrangement. It took us 2.5 years to be able to get this done. And finally it came through. And then the farmers themselves had a vested interest because they owned in part the warehouse. It was a shared ownership. And then they refurbished the warehouse so that it met the standards for storing the paddy so that they could be able to get a proper price and not have to sell the paddy at harvest time when the prices were lowest. So this type of scheme as a financial instrument, warehouse receipt schemes, among others, should be looked at and developed much more and in much more abundance by the financial community. And I'm talking about commercial banks, the microfinance, and it can be done really through proper partnerships. So you ask a very good question, because how do you reach the smallholder farmer when those financial instruments, the units are looking at how can we produce? Why should we go to a warehouse? And then the banks are saying, why should we finance such a scheme? So it's an interesting challenge to meet. And I think that we need to look at more innovative solutions and blended finance solutions for helping the smallholder farmer along these lines.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Perhaps, Julio, you can connect with Kathleen if she's willing to share some other resources with you or possibly contribute that to Echo Community. Like to maybe jump into another question, or I guess maybe this is a follow-up on the Pix Bags. There's a question from Sean Potts. Is there some analog of a Pix bag that can be developed or manufactured at a village level? Have you come across something, Floyd or Noah, Kathleen, any of you, that might be something that could be built locally that would serve in the same form. Floyd, you mentioned drums, but maybe there are some other options as well.
Yeah, the Pix Bags, they're developed by a group in Larry Murdoch in Purdue, and they've set up a couple of manufacturing facilities, I think both in Eastern and Western Africa, if I remember right, in I believe it's Kenya where they manufacture some. To make something just like the Pix Bags, it's a little bit of an involved process. There's also been some nice work done on just triple bagging. A common plastic bag, if you have, say, 3 or 4 plastic bags layered, they can provide some protection against some pests. Again, it's hard to give a blanket answer to storing grains in plastic bags because, again, it depends on your commodity, the environment, and the pests. Again, the larger grain borer, you've got that problem. It's going to be hard to keep them out using any kind of plastics. But those the metal drums that are fairly available, the thick plastic drums that have the wide mouth tops that you can close off fairly well can be pretty effective at keeping pests out. The metal silos that are manufactured in various countries, Echo has a model of those. Those are a nice concept, those metal silos, which can be made any size from 5-gallon bucket to hold many bushels. Those are really tough to keep them hermetically sealed and with so many welded joints and seams in those, but they're a nice option. So there are various ways to try to achieve a hermetic seal storage, again, depending on the commodity and the pests.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Floyd, for that. We're going to jump a little bit away from maybe post-harvest to a topic that I'll just throw out to all of you. You might see it here. Joshua Tucker has a question about drip irrigation, and he's asking, does going large scale with your system, tank size, pipe length, decrease efficiency or increase complexity? Perhaps you could provide some perspective, either Kathleen, Noah, or Floyd, on that drip irrigation technology.
Well, yeah, certainly for us, we have used a fair amount of drip irrigation technology. It is a pretty amazing technology in many ways. It also has some drawbacks and some definitely some complexity issues depending on especially your water type. So in our area, we have very hard water. There's a lot of calcium in the water, and it comes out of solution after we pull it out of the ground and then calcifies within the drip tape itself. And so we have a very hard time maintaining drip tape for more than a year or two maximum. So it ends up requiring a lot of maintenance. When you're doing that on a small scale, just a couple beds, it's all right, but on a large scale, we haven't found it to be something that really is sustainable in our context. But of course, it could be in other contexts. But certainly, the larger you go, the more you have to deal with. The more difficult, like water filtration becomes, for instance, and some of these components that you might have to add into the system.
Okay. Thank you, Noah. Any other thoughts from other panelists on drip irrigation?
Yeah, and again, I think drip irrigation is an important technology, but again, there are other types of irrigation that are more appropriate for the smallholder farmer that can be done, that may be a bit more effective. So I think it depends on, again, the soil we're talking about, the particular type of crop that we're growing, and the size of the plot, and also the affordability of the technology and the long-term maintenance factor that Noah quite rightly highlighted. We need something that can be easily maintained and that the farmers can be comfortable with. So I think it's a graduated process as to with smaller to the medium size to the larger farms as to how they can apply the technology.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. I want to go back. There was a question about Noah, how do you make your biochar? What type of kiln or system do you use to actually produce your biochar?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I want to back up a little bit about the term biochar because it gets used in a few different ways. Biochar is, from what I've understood technically, it's just any kind of carbonized charred carbon source. You can use any source, whether it's wood or rice husks. There's all kinds of carbon sources that you can use. Any organic matter, then it gets carbonized in a hot but oxygen low environment. And so it's almost like burning, but you're burning it. You're kind of smoldering it in an environment that has very low oxygen, and so then most of the carbon structure is retained, whereas a lot of the other impurities in water are burnt off, and then you get a material left over that, it's mostly kind of a carbon lattice, which is great as a fuel source, great for some of the purposes that we use it for in agriculture. On our farm, we basically use charcoal. Like we are doing this process with wood, and so our fuel source is the wood itself. We pile up a pile of wood about head high, so about almost 2 meters high, maybe 5 meters across. We cover that in grass, then covered it in sand to kind of keep the as much as possible. Then we have a little chimney, and we burn it over a course of about 3 days. You can do a fairly similar system with almost any fuel source. You can just kind of pile it up, keep the oxygen out of it, or put it in a barrel, keep the oxygen out of it and burn it. But some components might not burn well enough that they'll burn all on their own. And in that case, you often will use some other fuel source to kind of get enough and speed up the process. But in our case, we're just using wood.
Okay, thank you, Noah. And I think there's another question related to biochar. What makes it better than compost? And I think you've hit on some of that. I don't know if you want to elaborate. If you had to choose between compost and biochar, which would you choose, or would they go together well?
Yeah, they would definitely go together well. I see them as having slightly different uses, or very different uses. In fact, compost is incredible in terms of the life that it holds. And so to me, the most important question you need to ask about your soil is not, is it clay rich or is it sand rich? Is it, what are its physical characteristics? How it's the amount of life in my soil. And compost is a way of bringing a lot of life and also a lot of the food that life requires and adding it to your soil in terms of, or in the form of decomposed organic matter. Compost therefore serves as a food source for your plants, also a food source for future generations of life in your soil, but it will not last forever. The organic matter that makes up compost will increase the water holding capacity of your soil and the nutrient holding capacity of your soil, but in time it will itself continue to decompose, and you'll need to add more organic matter to replace that organic matter that was the compost. Biochar, on the other hand, it doesn't provide any life. It doesn't provide any food for life. So it's not doing either of those things. You're not adding life to your soil. You're not adding food for life to your soil. You're adding basically a container that can hold a lot of nutrients in your soil. And then so you can kind of see it as just increasing the battery capacity of your soil to hold nutrients. But that capacity will be stable over a long period of time because the biochar isn't going anywhere fast. It'll be there for decades.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Noah. I wanted to maybe pause here and bring our discussion a little bit back to appropriate technology for increasing smallholder production. We've talked a lot about biochar, but I'm just want to throw this out to the three panelists. What do you see as some of the key obstacles to adoption of a new technology, some novel technology? Kathleen, you might be a good one to address this as you are thinking or working with rolling out a no-till hoe, which I'm curious to see what that looks like. But what are the obstacles that you anticipate as you consider rolling that technology out to farmers?
I do believe that there, first of all, is a sensitization process that needs to be developed. And it's important that anybody that is rolling out these types of instruments and tools understand the local environment and also have local partnerships and local either distributors or other perhaps NGOs or other actors that are already training and working with farmers on the ground on smart agriculture practices and techniques. So what we intend to do, which has been done already by my colleagues as well and myself and other different areas, but the point being to bring this together and be able then to discuss what are the attributes of the no-till hoe and why is it shaped a certain way and how it can make the weeding process that much easier, the sowing process easier, the planting process, and make it easier for the smallholder farmer. So it's an integrated approach that needs to be taken. And this is not an obstacle nor a constraint, but it's an absolute prerequisite introducing any new type of instrument for the smallholder farmer on the ground, where he or she has been so used to working with hoes and other forms and other tools for many, many years. So that's something that it becomes a challenge, and one has to face that up front in order to introduce these. And we have tested the hoe as well as the dryer. And there's a third product, which is a cargo bike, which makes it a lot easier to move product from the rural areas to the more commercialized centers of production. But again, this process requires establishing very strong local partnerships and also working, in fact, with the financiers, the microfinance institutions and the SACCOs or the cooperatives, depending on what rural area we're looking at, especially in I'm talking about the developing world at this stage.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. Noah or Floyd, do you want to add anything to what Kathleen has said?
Let's start with, I do see that Richard Stroshine is in the audience, and he may at some point want to comment further. He's from Purdue University. He may want to comment further on those Pix Bags. But as far as adoption, gosh, it's almost disheartening to travel around and see the number of failed Western ag projects that we've tried to do in various countries. There's definitely a need for buy-in when we are trying to help work with certain groups. There definitely needs to be a pull. I like to think in terms of pushing and pulling. A lot of times we sit on our couches here and or in our conference rooms and come up with some neat technology that we try to push into some community rather than looking for the pull of what are they actually needing. Another plug for ECHO, what I really like about ECHO is you have your training centers in various countries and a lot of local people working at those training centers where that they can have input on the design concepts and learn for themselves and give input back to the staff of what their local community issues are. So that dialogue or partnership with the local communities is just so important.
Right. So that's why we're talking about creative capacity building at this virtual fair. Noah, any thoughts that you might have about that? Obstacles to adoption or experiences? Have you any notable failures you want to confess to us? Or
I mean, I think the most obvious failure or at least in the region I am in, is probably actually drip tape. Drip tape is everywhere. People use it everywhere. In the smallest village, people are using drip tape. But the one thing they're not using it for is irrigation. It gets used to tie up fences. It gets used to tie up horses. It gets used to tie up all kinds of things.
It's great lashing material.
Yeah, it's a very useful material, but it's not getting used for its kind of primary intended purpose. I do see it sometimes in use for irrigation, but it's mostly on kind of larger scale farms. Certainly small scale farmers aren't using it. And I think it's because of some of those maintenance issues, animals chewing it, and all the equipment that's needed to kind of use it on that scale. So I don't think it's as appropriate as we might have hoped on really small scales.
Okay. Thank you, Noah. I'm going to jump. We have one more question I see here from Michael Fenema, and he's working with probably shifting agriculture, upland farmers on steep slopes, and they're trying to move farmers towards a more permanent farming system. And so he's wondering whether the three of you have interacted with or know of appropriate technologies that can benefit farmers in a swidden type of farming system, so a shifting agricultural farming system, basically slash and burn type farming. Any thoughts there?
That's really problematic because the slash and burn is being utilized at such a large scale. And so therefore it's really causing a lot of deforestation, as we all know. And again, there is, I believe, this sensitization factor and issue and education at the farmer level to say, well, what other alternatives can we have to conserve the soil and not have to, and rotate crops, and crop diversification is another really big issue. And I know that I've worked with some farmers in northern Tanzania that are growing the coffee, but they're looking at the crop diversification in order to attempt to have their farmer groups not use slash and burn. I know this sounds like a simplistic answer, but they're looking to ways to discourage for the farmers from using the slash and burn, and say we need to grow trees, we need to look at agroforestry as an industry, we need to plant the trees, we need to save the environment. And these are not just slogans again. Actually, he's been very successful as a unique case, I must say, to be able to discourage farmers from slash and burn methodology, which they've been using for years. So there are ways to do this. It's just a question of again, working at local levels to educate and work together, and then demonstrate and actually go there and spend some time, which I've been doing a lot of up until recently, unfortunately, on actually working with the farmers and being able to say, well, what do you think, and getting their buy-in and getting their, as was mentioned earlier by the other two panelists, very, very important.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. I think some of that helped to address another question by Drew regarding transitioning from single crop, commodity crop farming, cacao or coffee, into a more diverse food production system, also on mountainsides. So we normally don't think of maybe crop diversification as an appropriate technology, but I think it certainly is. We are approaching the end of our session. Maybe are there any comments that either of you, the panelists, want to share with us, or this would be an opportunity for a last-minute question if anyone wants to type that into the chat.
I guess, do the participants have a way to contact us through this conference if they have follow-up questions other than Googling our names? I'm happy to follow up as needed.
Good question.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, Renee is going to type that right into the chat window on a way of connecting. I'm not sure what that is. There's multiple ways that it could happen, but I believe the event stays live for a number of months after this event. So there's other ways that participants can still connect through this app. You could also connect through Echo Community Conversations. That would be another way to connect. So I think that we are out of time. I think we could probably go for hours here easily, but I just want to say thank you to our 3 panelists for being with us today and sharing from their experience and perspective. This is truly something that I think it is Echo's desire to bring people together and to share ideas and share experience. And so it's really great to be doing this today with you all. So thank you, Kathleen and Floyd and Noah, for being with us. Thank you for your time. And also thank you for the questions that came through the participants. Thank you all for being a part of this session. I think we will be jumping to our closing remarks for the conference or the virtual fair in a few minutes. And I would just put in a plug right now for all of you to join us on November 19th for our virtual conference this year. So again, thank you all, and continue the conversation as you will, and thank you for being with us today. So